Hi, my name is CJ and this is my RC hobby. We're about to begin the assembly of the Timber X. There's some things in the instructions. They don't exactly list each step by number per se. For example, the first thing that you should do is the transmitter setup. They give you some information about safe select. They discuss the pre-flight steps, and that's pre-flight from opening the box to flight in very broad strokes. And then they have the transmitter setup. Now, this is the general setup, and it has a variety of different radios here, a bunch of different spectrums listed. If you have a DX series radio, make sure you select the right one. For example, this batch of instructions is for the DX8 and the 7S, but you might have a DX8 that is Gen 2, such as mine. So that, in that case, you would use this block of instructions right here. Now, as I mentioned in the unboxing video, this airplane can be set up so that the flaps function as ailerons so that you have full wing length ailerons for aerobatic maneuvers. That's not the basic bind and fly setup. For that one, you're going to want to turn on my manual. It's page 15, and that's going to give you, for the DX Gen 2, that's this batch of setup instructions here, and that allows for you to have, even though there's 2 servos for the flaps and 2 servos from the ailerons are using a Y connector, and so that will be considered 1 servo. So the configuration is 1 aileron servo, 2 flap servos, because the flap servos, but for the default, are set up to run as a single servo, also using a Y connector, because they are put at the same angle to each other. With ailerons, you point the servos in opposite directions, so left turns one way, right does the other. With flaps, you want both the flaps to come down, so both of the flap servos point in the same direction, both left or both right. And so a Y connector allows them to both lower the servos. But we're not going to be using the Y connector. We're going to run the flaps on an independent channel each. And that will allow them to be used either as flaps or as ailerons, depending on the mode. To do that, you have to have at least a 7-channel transmitter. The receiver is capable of handling that extra channel output. So you need a 7, 8 or above. Now, the next step is to attach the landing gear to the fuselage. And really, these instructions are very easy to follow. There's very little to this. You have a page where you put on your landing gear, you put on the rear stabilizer and connect the linkage. You have a page where you attach the wing slats, and then you connect the 2 wing sections together, attach them to the airplane, and you're done. And from there on, it's just general setup, battery, tuning the radio as you wish, things of that nature. So as you can see, there's not much to putting these together. I am going to be using the wing slats. As I mentioned in the first video, I was not sure what this linkage here on the bottom of the rudder, it's attached to the tail wheel and it moves with the rudder, why this was here. This is for, because it looks like a pull-pull setup for the rudder, but the rudder already has push rod. This is for setting up the rudders on the optional float configuration for landing gear so that you can take the timber off and land on water. So those aren't something you're going to need to worry about unless you're planning on getting the floats. There are a couple of extra screws that go to the quick connectors. I would just keep these handy somewhere in case you lose one of the screws when you're adjusting servos out in the field. Then you have 3 bags, each with a different type of screw. Make sure you understand the difference between self-tapping and a regular threaded bolt or screw. The self-tapping have a much coarser thread. It narrows a bit towards the tip. These are to drive into plastic or some other material where, as they are screwed in, they will cut their own threads. Whereas this type of bolt or screw is designed to go into a pre-threaded, either a nut or into something like these metal bars that have holes that are drilled and tapped with threads, so that can screw in nice and easily. So keep that in mind. Make sure you know the difference. There's 4 of these to go and attach the 2 for each side. They mention 2 6mm bolts. The 6mm bolts are not in bags. They are here on this little part. And so you'll only need to remove one and loosen the other. I'll show you how that goes together. Then there's another pair that are self-tapping that are going to attach these little spring rods to the plastic landing gear mount there. And it's the 2 that they're slightly shorter than the other 2 self-tapping ones. They're 2 millimeters shorter, and they have a larger head to hold down this piece of spring rod. The remaining 2 self-tapping screws are to mount the rear stabilizer. So I'm going to set those aside for the moment. You'll need a small Phillips head screwdriver. And you just slide the landing gear into that slot. There's a flat portion on this bar. There's also a round portion on the other side. Make sure that it is flipped over so the flat portion is meeting up with the bottom of the landing gear strut. And you know what? As long as I'm putting these in metal on metal, I'm going to use a little bit of blue thread locker. Just rummage some of that up. Doesn't take much, just gonna put a little bit on the threads. Now, I just made that finger tight, so I won't fully tighten that until I have the second screw in place. Okay, that's one in place. Fumble. Now for the two self-tapping screws, set those aside. These do not require any thread lockers since they are being screwed into plastic. I'm just going to get them started, and I'm going to connect the center section and then tighten them down the rest of the way. So you take out that one screw and then loosen the second screw. Didn't have that in all the way. There we go. Want to make sure that second screw captures that piece of wire. There we go. And then you can tighten both of them all the way down, and then tighten the two self-tapping screws. Do not over tighten the self-tapping screws. You can tear the threads and they can't back out because they're screwed into plastic, so it's like having its own Loctite. Just snug them down on top of the wire. So, as you see, the landing gear can now rock back and forth. That's the reason to have those rotating metal blocks that the landing gear screws onto. So hard landings are not a problem. Okay, so the landing gear is done. Next step in the directions is the horizontal stabilizer. Here we have our two stabilizer halves. And we have our two rods, the standard composite and the optional steel. And as I mentioned in the unboxing video, since I'm unfamiliar with this plane, I'm going to use the composite to start. If you are not familiar with the plane, if you're not an experienced aerobatic pilot, you should definitely start with the composite. You can always switch later. It involves a more aggressive center of gravity. If you read the instructions, and I recommend the first thing you do is read the instructions thoroughly. It's only a handful of pages. If you use this spar or connecting rod, the center of gravity is going to be a little more forward. That makes the plane a little more nose heavy, but it also makes it more stable in the air. If you're gonna, once you get to the point where you can fly in a more aggressive manner, by all means switch and then rebalance the plane to the new center of gravity. Again, you should always check your center of gravity. This should be a pre-flight check kind of thing. One of the things you can do is put marks on the underside of the wing with a magic marker like a Sharpie. Or if you don't want to mark up the plane, put a small piece of paper tape like masking tape and put marks on that. That way you can always, just using two fingers, just verify your center of gravity before you fly. If you've switched to a different battery, that battery may be a little longer, a little shorter, it may be a little heavier in general, and depending on its position, it's going to alter that center of gravity slightly. You always want the plane to be balanced. Nothing will make you crash faster and make you more embarrassed than a badly balanced airplane. And that's the danger, and it really is a bit of a danger to be using the steel tail rod and the more rearward center of gravity. That is going to make the plane trickier to fly. It will be more stable at higher speeds during high, they call them alpha maneuvers, I believe. That's great if you are an accomplished pilot and can handle that. If you are even remotely new to this or coming back to the hobby after a while, let it wait. You can always switch later. Get the feel of the plane, get your flying legs under you, and put on the composite to start with. You can always switch. So step one, slide the rod in. Make sure you're using the right side. They have different graphics. Also, your control horn needs to be on the right hand side to connect to the rod, and it needs to be facing downward. Those just slide in. It shouldn't take any effort. That's all there is to that, with the exception of two screws to anchor them in place. Again, we are using a self-tapping screw into plastic, so no thread locker is necessary. And again, don't over tighten. It's not going to help, and you could tear out the threads. Just snug it down. One of the advantages of this is that you can take these off anytime you want. So if you're transporting the plane in a smaller vehicle, or you're bringing several planes with you, you can disconnect the control rod, take off the two stabilizer halves, and that makes the plane easier to arrange and pack. So that is done. Now we're going to attach the control rod. You just pop the little keeper loose. Basically, the rod is shaped like an L. You put that through the control horn on the bottom hole on the horn. You place this over the end and then rotate it around and clip it to the rod, and that holds it in place. And that's a very small hole, and if you've got big fingers, it can be a little difficult. One way to make it a little easier is to put something under the rod to keep the rod tensioned, to keep it from coming back through the hole on the horn. There we go. And it just snaps on. And there's our linkage.